fired.
315 and 314 for a shooting at Century Theaters. They're saying somebody's shooting in the auditorium.
Roger, keep your fires west of the smoke. You're clear hot. An officer hit. Send me the world.
Don't go over that fence. Don't go over that fence. Grab the shotgun again.
Welcome to Tactical Tangents.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 2 of Tactical Tangents. My name is Mike and I'm here with Jim. Last episode we talked about that Utah nurse incident where the cop arrested the nurse in Utah for not doing a blood draw. And one of the things that we talked about was how a lot of people on the internet were getting really wrapped up around the legality of the whole thing, whether or not it was a good arrest, whether or not he was allowed to arrest her, whether or not he was allowed to take the blood. And one of the things we talked about was it doesn't really matter. Regardless of if he was operating within policy and within the legal parameters of his authority, it didn't make any difference. It was still handled poorly. And so what we're going to talk about today and kind of as a spinoff from that conversation is going back to kind of the nuanced part of police work, how we apply common sense and good judgment to and critical thinking to the decisions that we make. And specifically today, what I want to talk about is how we take rules and laws and those sorts of things and apply them to managing risk. So we obviously have rules and laws for a reason, and they're most of the time those are good reasons. If we take laws as a society, right, it's an accepted kind of code of conduct for how we're going to behave. It shapes our decisions as citizens living amongst each other for how we're gonna go about our day. As police officers, those laws shape my decision-making in terms of enforcing those things, right? And then we also have rules in the sense of our employees or our employers or our agencies might have decisions that they're making to protect, their own liability or our individual, their employee, the liability of their employees, or maybe they're trying to keep, it's a public safety thing or an officer safety thing or the safety of their employees, right? They have interests and they're writing those things down. They're codifying them on paper so that we can use them to shape our decision making. That's what they're intended to do. So think about this in a more general sense, right? If I'm a rock climber, the law of gravity suggests that I use a rope, right? And so maybe I decide not to use a rope, but that comes with some risks, right? So don't think of this in the procedural sense of if I break a rule, I'm going to get in trouble. That's not what we're talking about. Or if I break a law, I'm going to get arrested, right? What we're talking about is how we use those rules or guidelines in life, just in general, to shape our decision making, right? So as a general rule, this is when I would use my handgun, right? As a general rule, this is when I'm going to fight somebody or whatever. So that's what we're talking about, is applying rules and guidelines, whether those are in writing or whether those are just kind of in our head or whether those are laws of physics, whatever it may be. We're using that to shape our decision making, and we have to tie in common sense and good judgment, because there are going to be times where we have to challenge the assumptions that we're making and figure out when certain rules don't apply and when we have to write a new script on the fly. And that's kind of what we're getting at in this talk. So Jim, what's your take on rules and risk?
The really more guidelines. In flying, we have laws that were made by Newton. That's things like gravity, inertia, momentum, and you don't get to break those laws.
Isn't that Galileo? Isn't that Galileo?
Galileo?
He's the guy that dropped the apple off the tower, right?
No. Well, maybe, I don't know.
Okay.
I've slept through physics class, but those are laws. And we also have like 11 million rules, right? The FAA, and they're written by everyone from Congress to like my cat. And some of those rules you need to follow, and some not so much. But if you're going to break a rule, you need to do it on purpose. You need to know what rule you're breaking. You need to know why you're breaking it. And your execution has to be flawless. If you're going to buzz the tower, don't hit the tower. You have to have a positive outcome. And when you can, you talk it over with your boss and you get an exception to it. That way you don't go to jail and you don't get fired for it. You say, hey, boss, we're going to need to do this thing. We're, flying, a good example, we're taking off heavier than we're allowed to take off. We think we can do it. Here's why I think it's safe. Here's my plan for making sure that we bring the plane home safely. That's what I'd like to do. And then you get your boss to sign off on it, and then you're not really breaking a rule. Yeah.
Like in my line of work, we have a rule that says you can break any of the rules as long as you can justify it. And that's kind of what you have to take. You have to have that wherewithal to tell yourself that, all right, I'm going to go a little bit out of bounds here, but I know by doing that I'm holding that bag, right? That I own.
Yeah, and you're going to have to justify it, and you're going to get second guessed and judged for it, especially if you have a bad outcome, right?
Yeah. So it's kind of what we're going to talk about today is dealing with risk and managing that risk. And if you're a normal person, you make risk management decisions all the time. If you're going to go out of town, maybe you leave a light on, or maybe you have a neighbor grab the mail or whatever. If you're driving your car, you decide whether or not you should text while you're driving, right? And there's obviously, we don't recommend that you should do that, but for public safety personnel, the direction that we look at it is we're making decisions about risks and benefits on the possible outcomes based on, and I use law enforcement obviously as my example, but I have to balance the risk of public safety. So obviously if someone is a danger to the public, I have to deal with that. I have to balance that with the risk to myself. Is the juice worth the squeeze personally for me? And then obviously I have to manage the risk to the bad guy, because, we have to be balanced and obviously judicious in the way that we apply force to people. And I can't justify using an amount of force for certain things based on, I have to weigh his interests too, right? Because he's a citizen. So if I force myself into a shooting with a person, for example, and my decision-making leading up to that could have played a role to the outcome, then that might raise some questions. So if everything goes well, we have a positive outcome, then that's okay. But what we have to be ready for is when things get sideways. If I decide to buzz the tower and I hit it, right, then obviously I'm going to own that, and that's on me. I was told I can't do that, and so that's part of what we're getting at. So,
and Mike, one that you bring up a lot is car chases and chasing bad guys. And can you talk me through, you see a guy blow through a stoplight. Is it worth killing him to chase him? Or is it worth killing him or the person he runs into to chase him?
Yeah, and it's a perfect example of balancing the risk to the public, to myself, to the bad guy, right? So you have a guy that's driving recklessly, and let's just work under the assumption that maybe he's drunk, right? If by chasing him, if he doesn't want to yield to my command to stop and he's going to take off, maybe by chasing him, I'm able to stop him, right? And that eliminates the danger to the public by stopping him and ultimately enforcing that, as opposed to if I back off and I let him go and he continues driving crazy and recklessly, then he crashes into a school bus or, a house or something like that, right? And so there's some people that will make the argument, well, if you weren't chasing him, then he wouldn't have been driving like that. And so,
and I think that's BS, because, that guy could do it. He could be dangerous whether you chase him or not.
Yeah, and at what point does us not doing anything, that's probably not the first, and by not doing anything, it's probably not going to be the last time he does that either, right? So you're constantly weighing the interest of the public, the interest of the bad guy, the interest of yourself. There's a balancing act that happens there in terms of risk that is kind of delicate, and I can't tell you that I have the right answer on that. I can tell you that my individual experience at the place where I work is we are less likely to chase people than many other places. There are areas where a police department has someone who doesn't stop for them and they're going to chase them, and we have to at least be able to at some point call that off and say, hey, this isn't really worth it. Maybe we should just let this guy go, right? And so it's a balancing act, and I don't have the right answer for you, but that's something that we have to apply critical thinking and good judgment to, and that's kind of what we're talking about. So, we have to. The idea here is that we're balancing those risks. We're anticipating all the outcomes. And what we know is that in real life, we don't have time to sit down and write out the pros and cons and to try to make a risk assessment based on, some mathematic formula. There's some of this we have to do on the fly. And on one hand, we don't want to hamstring ourselves and be so risk averse that we ride the bench, right? We can rest on the bench and we're never going to score a winning touchdown, right? We're going to lose the game. So we have to balance. There are calculated risks that we have to take. We don't want to hamstring ourselves, but at some point we're going to have to man up and we're going to have to step up to the plate, right?
And that's a big problem in the military. I as a leader, I want to keep my troops safe. And the way to keep them safe is I keep them on the base. Except in Afghanistan, that doesn't help any. All you're doing is sitting there eating and drinking water and using fuel and checking Facebook, and you're not out there fighting and killing the bad guys. And yeah, you're safe, but we're also not winning the war. And related to that is humans kind of suck at assessing risk. Our little ape brains just aren't very good at turning statistics into something meaningful. One example of that is every mom I know is concerned about having a gun in her house, more or less. But very few are concerned about having a pool near their house. Even if pools kill more kids, the way they perceive the risk of a gun versus a pool is different, right? And on a related note to that, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head. I don't have them handy. But I believe that job-related injuries and deaths for police officers are roughly comparable to a lot of kind of mundane jobs. I think garbage men, get injured probably about as often as cops do. They may not get shot as often. Maybe they do, depending on where they are. And that isn't to say that the job isn't dangerous, but it's important to have a sober view of how dangerous the job is and what things make it dangerous. For example, are more cops shot to death, or are they killed in car wrecks? And I think when you understand kind of the statistical relationship there, are you putting enough time and attention into things like driving safely versus shooting skills?
Yeah, when I became a cop, one of the guys that I rode with told me that he's kind of old school, and so he doesn't use his seatbelt much.
Oh, that drives me crazy.
Yeah, and when I trained people, I that was like day one stuff. I was like, hey, let's talk about this whole thing about if one of your other training officers ever told you something about a seatbelt, then let's really discuss this. Do you think the odds are higher that you're going to get ambushed in your car, or that you're going to get in a car crash? I'm here to tell you the numbers will show you're more likely to get hurt in a car crash. So wear your damn seatbelt.
And this is one of the things where Mike brings a special set of skills to the table: nunchuck skills, bear fighting skills, and also he's an EMT by background, and he's seen a lot of mangled bodies in car wrecks. Right. Yep.
So, and the big one here, and that's kind of to play off of what Jim said, is that a lot of it has to do with predictability. What makes the job dangerous for police officers is there's a lot of things that you cannot predict about the job. If I go to a call or I'm interacting with somebody, I don't know if they're going to be cooperative or not. I don't know if they're going to try to kill me or not. There's a lot of variance in the things that I'm going to face. If my job is, I'm a guy that works on power lines all day, well, that job's pretty sketchy because I'm up on a pole and I'm dealing with like 1 billion volts or something like that. But those are risks that they're established, they're measurable.
I think it's the amps. I think the amps are what kill you.
Yeah. Well,
oh my God.
I'm not going to go find out.
We're going to get comments about that.
I had a couple. Yeah. We could play. Yeah. We could tase each other and we could talk about volts and amps.
Let's do it.
I think that's in the lesson plan. So. but like, if I'm the power line guy, those risks are established, they're measurable, and I have a pretty good idea of when things are going to get weird, right? It's not when I'm sitting in my truck, it's when, I strap on my harness and I start climbing that pole. And so I have that time to sit down and deliberately plan out and anticipate all those possibilities. And so part of our flexibility in our decision making is when I have the chance to plan something, to almost over plan it. and when I have to rely on common sense and good judgment and just kind of anticipate possibilities.
Exactly. It's not the plan per se, because situations change, but going through that planning process is huge. So one thing I learned from the military is deliberate risk and urgent risk. If you're planning something, say your department's going to go train live fire in a shoot house with another agency. Maybe they're more proficient, maybe they're less proficient, I don't know. But that's a higher risk event. You want to sit down and you want to have a quorum of sober people take a look at the plan and throw some spears at it. You want to really think about what could go wrong, how likely it could go wrong, and what it is you're going to do about it to make those things less likely or less dangerous, right? You pack a first aid kit. Well, maybe you'll have an ambulance on site, that sort of thing. In a more urgent situation, like you're about to enter a house on a burglar alarm call, do what the trauma docs do. Take a second for safety. Hey, where am I right now? Am I even at the right house? Where are the friendlies? What could be on the other side of that door? Am I better off waiting for help? Ask yourself just a couple of what I call sober up questions. Let the adrenaline wear off a little bit. Still stay ready, still stay alert, but think about it right before you go through that door.
Yeah, it only takes a second. It's that split second where we have the mental awareness to just hold up and ask myself, what do I expect to happen next? And what if it's not what I expect? So if I expect that to be an empty building, for example, well, what if there is a guy in there? Then what? What are the ways this can go wrong? and asking yourself that question, like you said, throw spears at it and kind of go through that process of what are all the bad ways this can turn out? What are the negative outcomes?
Yeah, and one of my favorite things that good tacticians do is they're constantly running through their list of what could go wrong, and they're building little contingency plans. Picture that giant decision tree. And the really, really smart tactics guys tend to have very elaborate decision trees. Fundamentally, they might be simple, but they're constantly working on them.
Yeah, so if we take this and we apply it to rules or policies or laws or whatever, and like Jim said, it has more to do with the process than it does whatever the actual plan is, right? If we're making a plan about some high risk event, or even if we could just be talking about driving to work in the morning or going out of town or something, and we're looking at possible risks and possible outcomes. Just going through that process and asking yourself what could go wrong, brainstorming what are the possible outcomes. We go through the ones that we really don't want, and we figure out if there's an easy way to mitigate it. And sometimes, and especially in law enforcement, sometimes you come up to a situation and you're like, well, this might go weird. This could end really bad. But you do that and you know it, right? That's a calculated risk.
Send in the rookie.
Yeah,
that's what they're there for.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the good examples I had of this is back in the day, a bunch of police officers learned about the 21-foot rule, and we still talk about it from time to time. But there was a guy that did some research, and it basically had to do with reaction time. And what he was trying to do is figure out how much distance could someone cover if they were coming at you with an edged weapon, a knife or something.
I like to picture a battle axe.
Yeah, or a battle axe. But someone has something in their hands. It's not necessarily a ballistic weapon. I guess theoretically he could throw it, but someone is standing across from you with a knife or an edged weapon of some kind, and he starts charging at you. About how much time, translated into distance, does that give me to react, where I have to draw my gun and shoot a guy, right? And what he found was about 21 feet. People could cover a distance of about 21 feet in the amount of time that it takes me to pull my gun out of my holster and shoot a guy that's charging at me. And the lesson there wasn't so much about the number 21 feet. What we're trying to do is illustrate.
It's not a rule, it's an idea.
Right.
It's a concept.
Exactly. Or it's an illustration, right? It's just to help us remember that action is faster than reaction, that time is distance, right? 21 feet and I think my Crown Vic is something like 18 or 19 feet or something like that. So if one person was standing a foot or so off of each bumper on opposite sides of a Crown Vic, they're about 21 feet apart, more or less. So,
and it's a Ford, so it'll be stopped. So
yeah, but it's a rough illustration, but you see what I'm talking about. That's flat terrain, no obstructions, things like that. And people started thinking about this as the 21-foot rule, and they're like, well, why'd you shoot him? Well, he was within 21 feet. Well, what if he was sitting down? What if there was an obstruction between you and him? What if instead of in your holster, you had your gun out of your holster? There's a lot of what ifs, right? But it was just an illustration to get us thinking about action versus reaction. But some cops still look at that as a rule.
Yeah, why not just taser him or something?
It's a good question. So, ironically, and the taser that I carry now has a 25-foot range. But the first
interesting that they would select that distance.
Well, the first one that I got was a 21-foot range. Now, that's so the way the taser works is there's a cartridge that fits onto the end of the quote unquote gun, if you will, right? And when the cartridge is fired, 2 probes come out of the cartridge and they have wires attached to them that go back to the taser itself, right? Those wires are coiled. And so at full extension, the first taser model that I had a 21-foot cartridge. The second one that I got is a 25-foot cartridge, but that's at full extension. So you can imagine that if they've been coiled up for a while, there's a little bit of spring to them.
Yeah, and I can't imagine you ever intentionally zapping a guy from that far away. Like, typically they'd be a lot closer to you, right?
Right. But if you think about, so let's go back to the quote unquote rule, right? The 21-foot rule says that action is faster than reaction, right? And it says that in the amount of time it would take me to draw and fire my gun, an average person could cover a distance of about 21 feet in open ground.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at that reaction time and I pull out my taser and I fire that thing at a person and that guy decides to charge at me, you see what I'm getting at? How much distance can he cover in the amount of time it's going to take me to throw that thing aside and pull my gun out and shoot him? Now, this is kind of what we're getting at. Are there things that we can do to mitigate that risk? Well, maybe I can have a guy already out and on gun. And so now it's not just me. So if I'm going to deploy a taser, I've got someone else there to hopefully help mitigate that 21-foot distance / time. And again, we're not going to call it a rule, we'll call it a concept, right?
And that's a big deal that a lot of lay people outside of the tactical community don't get, is that de-escalation is a lot more viable if you've got a partner who can fix it if it goes wrong, right? You're taking a risk by saying, I'm not going to shoot this guy, I'm going to zap him, or I'm going to talk to him, or I'm going to go hands-on with him, which is gross because at best you're going to get his funk on you.
Well, and it's the thing about de-escalation is that what you're trying to do is mitigate the risk, right? And this is actually one of my big gripes in law enforcement. So bear with me while I go off on a little tangent here. But
oh no,
so we talk a lot about de-escalation nowadays, and obviously we want police officers to value human life and to end things peacefully and all those things, right? But by constantly talking about de-escalate, what we're doing is we're creating a bias in favor of inaction, right? Of not doing anything. And so what my argument is that we need tactical flexibility. We don't want to call it de-escalation because I want guys to be or gals to be just as quick at going up as they are at going down. And so if I walk into a room, and we've actually done some of this in training recently. If I walk into a room, I want to take a snapshot assessment of that room, right? And if I see a guy over in a corner or something, and he's got a knife or a gun, I want an accurate snapshot of, is there an immediate danger to my life or someone else's life that requires me to shoot this person? If that answer is no, right? Then I've created space and time in my head, maybe not physical space or time, but now I have the mental space to try to do something about that guy, right? that comes in making that accurate snapshot, that split-second judgment, split-second assessment when I walk in the room. So if that guy's got a knife, do I want to is there anything, can I create distance? Can I put a barrier between me and that person? If I can do those things and I can mitigate that reaction time that the 21-foot quote-unquote rule at one time illustrated, if I can mitigate that time a little bit, create more time, create more distance, create some obstructions, now I have the opportunities to try to talk with the guy, try to coordinate additional resources, try to get more help, try to slow things down, X, Y, and Z. But if I talk so much about de-escalation that I create hesitation in people and I get people that don't necessarily want to take that shot, or they think that they've got to put themselves in a position of disadvantage in an effort to de-escalate, then what I'm doing is I'm asking that person to take additional risks. And that is more likely to force a shooting than if I was to make an accurate, focus on flexibility, right? Focus on the ability to move up or down as quickly as possible and finding that space to adjust and mitigate risk. That's that's my gripe with it. So for example, earlier today, I was at the academy helping some new officers. So they've graduated the academy and now they're getting ready to go into field training. And we were doing their active shooter training. And one of the things that we talked about was how active shooter training has to be aggressive, right? This is where if we talk all the time about de-escalating, if we talk all the time about peaceful outcomes, and the one that I hear all the time, which is good, it is slowing things down, right? We use a phrase, and Jim, I imagine you've probably heard or used it in the military too, but we use a phrase called operational momentum. So you find yourself in some kind of confrontation or situation, and you get so involved with what's happening that you just keep moving forward. And you never take that second to slow down. And like we talked about earlier, we talked about taking that split second where we go, what if this doesn't end the way that I expect it to end? Or what if what's on the other side of this door is not what I expect it to be, right? And we have to be able to be flexible with that. So we talk a lot about slowing things down. We talk a lot about taking that, we'll call it a tactical pause, right? Where you take that second and you ask yourself those difficult questions. Well, there's also times where every extra second that you take, innocent people are being murdered, right? If we go to the active shooter, the school shooter example, and we think about a guy running through a school shooting the place up, and you take that moment at the door and you go, hold on a second, what if, right? You're thinking all these things and you're thinking about how to mitigate this risk because you know that the situation you're going into is going to be risky. All that time that you're taking, bam, bam, bam. Those are innocent bodies hitting the floor, right? And so we have to be flexible. In that situation, this is your freebie. De-escalation training does not apply here. This is your time to shine. You are the hunter. Go find, close with, and kill that guy who's murdering innocent people, right? And we have to teach people how to be aggressive in that sense. The only way that we do that is by emphasizing flexibility, right? I want police officers to be able to slow things down, to be able to talk with and communicate with a guy. I also need police officers to be able to kick it into gear, go on offense, and find the bad guy.
So you're constantly kind of adjusting your posture, right? And that's what we mean by agility and flexibility. Is you're assessing the situation, you're processing it, and you're saying, well, right now, I need to slow things down. Well, right now, I need to speed things up. Right now, things are getting out of hand. I got to do something to break this other guy's momentum, right? And your risk analysis is continuous. And taking it back to my world and flying, if you're in a single-engine airplane, you are constantly updating your plan for if you become a glider. And so you're looking at it, you're saying, okay, well, I'm over a bunch of jagged mountains. That's bad. So my plan is to fly down that valley until I can get to flat land. or my plan is to eject and give this airplane back to the taxpayers.
Can you land on the Hudson River? That's my question.
I cannot, but there's this guy named Sully who went to the United States Air Force Academy who apparently could, and props to him. That dude's a badass.
But that's got to be so. If you're flying, and you have an engine fire or something blows up in your plane, I don't know how it works, but something happens, right? And now you're a glider, like you said, a heavy one with not as big of wings.
Nope.
And you've got to select a spot to set it down. None of them are great, right? But you're okay. Do I want to go down into vegetation? Do I want to go on somewhere flat like a road, like asphalt? Do I want dirt? Do I want the Hudson River, for example? Right, and that you have to weigh the pros and cons there, right? Is that something that you think about?
Yeah. So I always go back to my, the core tasks that every pilot has to do. I have to maintain aircraft control. I have to analyze the situation, take the proper crew coordinated action. I have to land as soon as conditions permit, and they might permit real darn fast. So one of our things is no fast hands in the cockpit. So I'm going to talk about what I'm doing, and we're going to work it out. So I'm going to say, okay, we're going to shut down the engine or all of the engines to keep them from catching fire on us and making our problem worse. I'm going to look outside. I'm going to involve my crew. I might get on the radio even, say, hey, I just lost all my engines. I don't see anything I can land in front of me. I need a vector right now to an airfield. And I'll talk to air traffic control. My aircraft has navigators, has a team of them. And so I'll say, hey, Nav, find me a flat spot right now. And if I'm not getting what I need, I'm going to look for the most expensive thing to crash into. And I'm going to crash into it. I'm going to try and do it as slowly as I can. But, that's one of the things, is you try to involve the rest of the team. Very, very few decisions do you have to make by yourself. And even as a cop, even if you're by yourself, you still have that radio, right?
Yep. And I think there's something to be said about going back to what you said about, okay, this is what I'm going to do next. Police work, any public safety job, situational awareness, if you're just a concealed carrier that is at the ATM, if you're flying an airplane, risk assessment and risk management is an ongoing thing, right? It's not like before you left your house that day, or when I was in briefing to go to work, or before you took off, that you sat down and you wrote every possibility. This was an ongoing process where you said, what if things don't go how I expected? So as I'm walking up to a door, I'm thinking about, okay, where's the closest cover and concealment? Where are the places that I can move? What if he comes out this way? What if he comes out that way? Just like how you're talking about your options. There's nothing flat around me. Where can I vector to? Or what are my options?
Maybe I can dump gas and make myself light. I mean, I have options, and just thinking through those options keeps me flexible.
Yeah. So, and your ego plays a role here too, because part of this process has to do with being honest about your vulnerabilities and also about your capabilities. So, and I'm confident that if you had to set it down on the Hudson River, you could.
Yeah,
but a minute ago when I said, what about the Hudson? And you're like, well, Sully could, I couldn't. I mean, I know that that's not true. I know that you could, but.
Well, there's a catch there, which is my aircraft has high wings, and so it's different, right? Like my decision process is different because I fly a different jet. And so my plane, if it touches water, will cartwheel. I know that because we've done it. So I could have the most golden hands in the world, and we're still probably going to cartwheel. Now, as it happens, first off, the dude was an amazing hands pilot, and his aircraft was well shaped for that landing. But that's one of the things, is you're constantly assessing, well, my situation, my unique set of circumstances is telling me don't do that.
So in that case, obviously, you're talking about the vulnerabilities of your specific aircraft, right?
Like for me, I might be better off landing in a soccer field because we've done that.
Right, and that's a short, obviously. So about your abilities and capabilities. So but also I want to think about it in terms of your ego And like,
Yeah.
so, and obviously you're a pilot, right? But like the same can be said about cops. If you've got to take a shot, is this a shot that I can make? And like, if I'm managing risk and I'm thinking about like, okay, this guy comes running out of the house and he's shooting at me, can I effectively return fire from here, or am I better off turning and burning? This might be something where I should try to build distance and come from another angle, right? And that takes me being honest with myself. But in your case, that you can land on a distant, on a soccer field, a short distance. So a little bit about this is being honest about your vulnerabilities and your capabilities. And this is how you have to build training and preparation into this, right? So when we're looking at the rules that we have to follow and whether or not we're going to break those rules, we're talking about risk. And I'm not talking about getting in trouble, guys. I'm talking about rules that are there to protect us, to protect our agencies, to protect our, the interests of the people that we serve in some cases. But, what we're talking about is most of those rules and policies and procedures and those kinds of things come from somewhere, right? And I don't want this to be confused with what we talked about in the last episode when we said just because we can doesn't mean you should, and those sorts of things. Really what we're talking about in this case is if I live by a certain set of rules, or if I'm governed by a certain set of rules, should I break those rules? And what are the risks? And we talk about going beyond, getting ourselves in trouble. And like I said, there could be procedural stuff to this. So if I wanted to look at a law enforcement example and a policy example, I could say something like, I've got a guy who is about to get on the freeway in the wrong direction. Maybe he's drunk, maybe he's not, I don't know. But I tried to pull him over, he's not stopping, and he's going to get on the freeway going the wrong way. Now, my department policy might say that if that guy is not stopping for me, I cannot chase him. However, there is a moment of opportunity here, whereas this guy is getting on the off-ramp onto oncoming traffic on the freeway. Before he gets up to speed, I might be able to stop and disable his car before he goes head-on with somebody and kills them, right? And so now I'm talking about mitigating risk. On one hand, if this ends poorly, right, that's on me. That's going to be completely on me. On the other hand, if I don't do something, someone is going to get killed. It might even be the guy, right? It might even be the driver. But it could also be, a minivan full of kids coming from soccer practice. So we're talking about mitigating risk in terms of making that split-second assessment of, what if this doesn't go the way that I thought it was going to go? The rules say that I can't really do anything about this guy, but if I don't, this is what's going to happen. And in this set of circumstances, I think that the risks outweigh the benefits of following the rules, and I take that chance, right? So that's what we have to be able to do kind of on the fly, is we're constantly balancing those interests. That's kind of what this is all about.
In a related concept to that, there's this guy named Charlie Beckwith who had a hand in creating a premier Army Special Operations unit. And one of his big sayings was that you have to know the rules in order to break them. And there's the beginner level of understanding rules, which is you can recite them, you can take a test on the rules and pass it, and that's great. But very quickly, as you get into any kind of organization, the military, law enforcement, concealed carry, you need to develop out your understanding of those rules and start asking questions and reading the history and understand the intent of the people who wrote those rules so that you know what it is you're breaking. Don't chase people. Okay, well, what we're trying to avoid is that bad outcome of chasing a guy for, blowing a stop sign and killing a family over it. That's what they're trying to avoid. But that doesn't mean you turn off your brain and let that guy run the wrong way up into a freeway and kill a minivan full of people anyway, right?
Yeah. And there's, like you mentioned, there's something to be said about knowing what those rules are there for And if you're going to break them, you got to know them. And that kind of goes back to the idea that we have to challenge our assumptions and we have to ask ourselves the difficult questions. Because if we go back to, the Utah nurse incident, and we tell ourselves that, well, yeah, he was within policy and yeah, he was within the law, does that make it a good idea? No, I mean, we have to challenge those assumptions and ask ourselves, why are we doing this? What are these rules even there for? What is in the police academy, what we talk about when we go over the legal stuff, and specifically state laws, we talk about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law.
I get a great story about that. So I went to a military academy, and, it's a weird place. It's very intense. It's like basic training for 4 years. And one of the rules that we had was no resistance training. Now, in a military context, resistance training is resistance to captivity interrogation. So we do that.
So waterboarding, obviously.
You handcuff a guy, you put a bag over his head, spray some water up his nose, and ask him what airplane he flies, right? Now, we do that. That's part of our aircrew training. We do it. We have specialists who train to do exactly that.
Quote,
so the
unquote.
academy had a rule, and they're good at it. I'm a big fan of the SEER instructors. And so we had a rule at the academy that cadets aren't allowed to do resistance training. You have to be a certified, Air Force instructor on it. Makes total sense, right? Big believer in that. So this one time at band camp, we were doing physical conditioning, and we were doing a thing where one freshman pulls up on a towel and one freshman pulls down on a towel. You could call it resistance training. And I had a classmate she flipped out. I will say that. And she's like, "Oh my God, we're not allowed to do this. This is a problem. We're all going to jail. Stop this right now." And we all looked at her like she was crazy.
Like resistance bands. Resistance bands or resistance training, not like...
Yeah. That was not a thing we wanted students just doing on their own. And that rule made total sense. But this classmate of mine misinterpreted that rule and flipped out about it and made us all look stupid.
Yeah.
So.
Right. So that's a perfect example of a time where, we have these rules and those rules are there to guide our decisions, but we had to apply a little bit of common sense to make sure that the rules applied to that situation, that they fit in with good judgment, right? And obviously in that case, it didn't. And sometimes we might decide that maybe the rules do apply, but for whatever reason, we've got to sidestep them or make an exception or break a rule because of the situation that we're in. And breaking a rule sets us up for risk by itself, right? Just breaking a rule might get us in some kind of trouble, and it's one thing that we have to consider. And the thing is that might be an acceptable risk, just like, exposing myself to some kind of danger might be an acceptable risk. These are sometimes, when we're making these decisions, sometimes there's competing interests, and we're making those judgment calls, right? We're trying not to get wrapped up in the administrative concept of following rules. What we're trying to do is shape our judgment and our decision making. And so a good example of this is I talked a little bit earlier about our active shooter training that we were doing. And we had these brand new officers that are just coming out of the academy, and they're going through active shooter training, and they had a guy that was running through a crowded courtyard full of people, and they're taking these 40 or 50 yard, shots on this guy with their pistol. Now there's no rules against that. So they're not, get beyond the rules thing, but think about the risks involved. First of all, is that a shot that I can reliably make? What are the possible outcomes, right? We're in a crowded place with a bunch of people, and if one of those rounds hits somebody, now instead of saving all these people, now I'm starting to take people's lives, right? Or at least injuring them, which obviously isn't ideal. So I have to make that split-second assessment of, is taking this shot worth the risk? I have to be honest with myself about whether or not this fits within my capabilities, right? And what we know is that many of us are likely to overestimate our own capabilities.
So along the lines of the cop stuff, I think it's important to talk about everyday carry and concealed carry, and this mismatch that a lot of shooters have about their own capabilities and their own proficiency. And they might have one very well developed skill. They might be able to drill a hole in a bullseye from 50 yards, and that's great. But if that same guy is carrying a gun and he's at an ATM and he doesn't have the situational awareness to see the guy coming up behind him, that gun isn't helping him. And so we need to talk about everyday carry, and we need to talk about carrying toys. And that's really all they are if you don't have the whole umbrella skill set around those toys. And the social skills and the situational awareness and the tactical awareness that might keep you out of the gunfight in the first place. And I also see people trick out their pistols with all kinds of gigas and Punisher emblems and stuff like that. But I tend to find people lack fundamentals. And I see it at the range. Every time I go to a civilian pistol range, I see guys with $2,000 guns who, frankly, aren't often hitting the paper.
Yeah, it goes back to that, that meme or that concept that you don't need a $2,000 gun, you need a $500 gun and $1,500 worth of training and ammo.
Yep.
So it's a good example of, like, personally, I didn't trick out my gun or do anything to my work gun until I was shooting a perfect score, right? And because I want to focus on those fundamentals. We know that when things get sideways on us, right? If we go back to some of those rules or laws and physics and things like that, that those fundamentals are what's going to get us out of trouble, right? And if we're being honest with ourselves, especially if we're talking about managing risk, and we ask ourselves, what are the types of things that are likely to get us into trouble? I can tell you from my experience, for example, that, I've got a handful of guns laying around the house, but it occurred to me one day that I don't have any fire extinguishers. I looked around my house and, maybe I was prepared for like the armed home invasion, but if my house caught on fire and I wanted to put it out, I wasn't going to be able to do that. I was going to have to run outside to my hose. And obviously by then it'd probably be too late. And that's assuming that I had an easy way of getting outside. So of the risks, of the list of risks to my household, I have to be honest with myself about how, the guns might be cool and I have a lot of fun and I could take them out to the range and I could put a lot of gadgets and I carry that with me every day. But if my house catches on fire, that's not going to do me any good. So a couple fire extinguishers for $30 from Costco went a long way, right? And I was guilty of that myself. So we have to think of risk management in terms of a phrase that John Boyd used to say, and we're going to talk a lot about Boyd in another episode. But one of the things that he used to say is that war is ever changing and men are ever fallible. Teach men to think. And he said that machines don't fight wars, people do. Teach men to think. And he always emphasized that you have to think of things in terms of people, ideas, and then hardware in that order. So when I think about people, I'm thinking about the human factor. I'm thinking about how our decision-making, our planning, our training plays a role, what kind of habits that I have, and all of those things that go into my interactions with other people, situational awareness, stuff like that. And then I want to think about the ideas. The ideas are how I plan for those human factors. For example, action is faster than reaction. So what tactics can I do or can I employ to adjust for the fact that action is faster than reaction? For example, if a guy comes at me with a gun, can I sidestep? Is that going to put him on a reaction? And, now he's got to adjust to me. Meanwhile, I'm sidestepping and I'm drawing my gun and shooting back, right? Little things like that where I can try to start to mitigate some of those little human factors, human elements in terms of action or reaction, just as an example. Things like training. Can I mitigate my reaction time? If I know that I'm going to be behind the curve, what can I do to try to compress the cognitive delay that's going to happen when I make that snapshot assessment of the situation that I'm in? And
one thing on that, there's formal training and informal training, right? Go take a class. You need to go take a class because you need someone other than you to point out your flaws. And then there's informal training, like dry fire training or practicing to draw in a mirror. And you need to do both.
It's also playing the what if game. It's asking yourself the difficult questions. What if this isn't what I expect, right? Those are some of the ideas that it's being honest about your capabilities, honest about your vulnerabilities. Those are all the things that have to go into how you train, how you practice, how you plan, prepare, right? And then the hardware comes last, because history has shown us that there are, in the history of conflict throughout the world, there have been ill-equipped forces that have dominated the battlefield for all of time, right? Guerrilla warfare 101. We cannot create a dependence on the hardware or the equipment. No gun is going to save our life. No rules are going to save our life, just like no bomb or missile or fancy airplane or anything like that is going to save our life. We can use those to help solve our problems and to mitigate our risks, but we have to make sure that we're employing them for the right reasons. So when we look at hardware, we want to make sure we're doing it for a specific reason, or we're trying to target a specific vulnerability or gain a particular capability, right? We're trying to look for particular elements, but we have to think about it in those terms when we're trying to manage and mitigate and assess risk. So if I want to apply this people, ideas, and hardware concept to risk management, these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. Earlier, I talked about the laws of physics, right, and gravity. If I want to put some kind of reliance on hardware in line with those rules, that's why I wear a rope when I go rock climbing, for example, right? And when Jim talked earlier about the swimming pool example, he talked about the risks of owning a firearm, having a gun in the house versus the risks of having a pool, right? The hardware element might be putting up a fence, and so there's value to that, right? But really what we need, and the most important thing that we can really focus on here at Tactical Tangents, if there's any message that you can take away from this, is the visibility and the mental clarity to take that step backwards and have that sober look at risk. One step removed, a little bit of detachment, where you can ask yourselves, what is actually likely to happen here? What if this doesn't go the way that I plan? Is this really the risk that's going to get me? The risk of wearing my seatbelt versus getting ambushed in my car, the risk of having a gun versus having a pool, the risk of having a gun on the nightstand versus having a fire extinguisher next to my bed, right? These are the human side of risk management that we really have to tie into our decision making and assessing the possible outcomes that we want to be prepared for in survival.
And the way you get better as a person and the way you get all those ideas into your head is we got to get you reading. It starts with stuff like this, the podcasts, the articles that we're putting out. And then once you get comfortable with that, and you start really building out your personal awareness. There are a lot of books out there that I think are really worth looking at, especially for risk. The book, The Signal and the Noise by Nate Silver, I think is absolutely important to take a look at. I also think there's a book about Pearl Harbor and how we kind of knew that it was coming, and we didn't really hone in on it. It's called Pearl Harbor Warning and Decision by Roberta Wohlstetter. And I think if you look at those two books, you will have a master's level understanding of risk. And I think that's a good start.
The two that I really like and that I'll probably refer to several times as you listen to this podcast, but if you go to our website, tacticaltangents.com, you'll find a reading list that we have, so you can find all these. I'll make sure that they're in the show notes. There's the two that Jim just talked about, but there's two that are important for me. One is very fundamental to our purposes here, and you'll notice that the people, ideas, hardware theme that we talked about here that came from John Boyd is actually found in our logo. There's a good book about him and about his life. It was his biography. It was written by Robert Karam, and it's called Boyd, the Fighter Pilot Who Changed the Art of War. And I think the big takeaway from that book, there's a lot of takeaways from that book in terms of decision making and you know, it's the kind of book that will change your outlook on the world. But the big value that I took from that is that you have to challenge your assumptions. You have to think critically about the choices that you're making. And you'll read a lot of examples of that in that book. And then the other one is called The Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley. The Unthinkable talks a lot about that deliberation process and the delay that happens when you are trying to assess risk. And it puts it in terms of things like the evacuations that happen around a hurricane, whether you should stay and shelter in place and whether you should go and things like that. And there's a lot of good case studies in that book pertaining to the sorts of decision making that we're talking about. So we'll make sure that those books, we'll list those in our show notes. You can also find links to them on our website, tacticaltangents.com. You can find them on Amazon. If you would, go through our website to find the Amazon links for those, and we'll get a little bit of credit back for purchasing those books based on the recommendations from the podcast. We'd appreciate that if you'd consider it, but if not, get the material. That's the important part. Get better, get smarter. That's what we're here for. And I think that's all I got for today, Jim, unless you got something.
No, sounds good.
All right, good talk.
Be safe.
Hey guys, just a real quick afterthought on this episode. Jim wrote a really thorough article on our website and on our Facebook page about risk management, and he also talks a lot about other lessons that he learned in military aviation. He talks a lot about the risk management process. The Air Force actually has a 5 or 6 step process where you go through identifying hazards, assessing the risks, developing ways to control those risks, and then evaluating how those measures worked. And he also talks in there a lot about decision making, crew resource management, things like that. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, but be sure to check it out. It's on our website, www.tacticaltangents.com. All the books that we talked about are in the show notes as well. Please consider checking those out. They're definitely worth your time. Take care.